My name is Pam Gallegos. I was born in Berkeley, California, where my mother had been going to the university there. My parents had just gotten married right after the war, so I'm one of the early baby boomers. And I grew up in Santa Ana and went to Santa Ana public schools, which were some of the finest, and I'm sure are still some of the finest. My parents thought so highly of the Santa Ana school system because it produced my mom that when I was 4.5, they came back to Santa Ana to enroll me in school here. So that was my beginning. And I got involved in community service, believe it or not, when I was 14 years old, and I was a candy striper at St. Joe's. And it really stuck with me. The ability to be of service to others was a profound influence on my life, and I have been involved in one way or another, or even in several ways at a time, in community service through such groups as Children's Home Society, raising money for the adoption, foster care, placement, even respite care for parents who've taken in children who are impaired in some way and need to get away for a couple days a month. So we raised money through our fundraisers, and we had some very innovative ways of raising lots of money and help those parents with their mission to take care of those displaced children. I've also been very involved in the origination of the Orange County Performing Arts. I was a founding member of Untitled Chapter, which was very appropriate for me because my mother always said that the gypsies dropped me off on the doorstep. The Untitled Chapter raised money for the foundation and the building of the Orange County Performing Arts Center, and that was back in the early 80s. In addition to that, I was active in Arthritis Foundation, raising money for research for that. I have several friends and my own mother very afflicted with arthritis. I was a very strong proponent of the fundraising and the charities that we aligned ourselves with at the Santa Ana Elks Club, and raised money through the Emblem Club, which is the women's arm of the Elks National. Very fine foundation. We raise money for scholarships, we raise money for vets, we raise money currently very, very much so in the way of placing vets in homes and residences they can count on and getting them more education and help in whatever direction they need to go. Homes for young mothers who have no support system. We also are very supportive of Sir Bruno Serrato over at the Anaheim White House, who feeds over 5,000 hungry kids a day because his mother told him to. He founded Katerina's Club, named for her, and we're very active in what he calls the Pastathon every year, which is a huge fundraiser. The last time my grandson and I participated, him through his school at Oak Ridge at the time, junior high, which is now called middle school. He was on the student council, and he brought Sir Bruno a check for $10,000, which I thought was just spectacular. And I looked up, and he was standing there, and he said to me, "Grandma, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, what are you doing here, Luke?" He said, "Well, I'm representing the student body." And he says, "You know something funny, Grandma? When I pulled up in the bus with all our pasta and all of our sauce and our check, I thought, wow, Grandma would really like this." I said, "You're right, I do." And so we took some pictures together, and pictures with him with his headmaster, and pictures of us with Sir Bruno, and it was just a lovely day of full circle. I have finally got a child who has it in his heart to help others, although my older boys were of the same. I brought them along in feeding the poor and etc. But it was really nice to see a third generation involved. When we moved down from Berkeley, we lived in my grandfather's house on Cypress near Cubbon, and it was a wonderful old typical craftsman house with built-in cupboards for books, and just a warm and cozy house with one of those old stoves that in those days, of course, we thought everything was up to date and perfect, and they worked perfectly well. But nowadays, of course, everything is so computerized and digitized. I just remember the smell of cinnamon in the morning. My mother would make oatmeal from scratch, of course, or she would make arroz con leche, and then at noon we would go home for lunch because we just lived a few blocks away from school, and she would have fresh tortillas. She was a Berkeley-educated Mexican mother, and we would watch Farmer John with our little neighbors, and then go back to school. So it was a completely different era. It was safe and lovely, and in the backyard we had my grandfather's collection of all kinds of citrus trees, grapefruit, lemon, orange, of course, and he had actually built on his property a headquarters for the Masons. He was a member of the Masons, and so we would peek in the window and see all those mysterious signs and the eye and the this and that, and we had no understanding of what was going on there. But I was never very much involved with dollies. I thought that was a bore. You could dress them and then take the clothes off, and then what? I was more tuned in to getting an umbrella and testing it out and seeing if it was true that you could catch the wind like Mary Poppins did and jump off the roof. Oh. And so one time I did that, and I mindlessly landed in a pile of old boards that Grandpa had there with a nail sticking out of it. And so I have a nice scar on my knee to remind me of that foolishness, but I got over it and got more involved with pets and things that were less dangerous. Although in college I kind of started up again, so those are some interesting stories to tell.
I hear that one. Sure.
I believe my grandfather arrived in Santa Ana from Arizona in 1913 or thereabouts. He came ahead of his family, and he started out across the street, coincidentally, from my husband's family's little store in Delhi. And he lived there for a bit, and then he decided that he would move to the north part of town, and he established his tailor business in the north part of town. So he wasn't there long, but they certainly remembered him. My mother-in-law remembered him very well. He came from Zacatecas, which is in the north. There's an interesting story about that because Maximiliano's soldiers were in that part of Mexico during that era when he was born. He was born approximately in the 1880s. He was the child of a beautiful Mexican woman and probably an Austrian soldier. My mother used to tell us that story, and my brother and I, would say, "Mom, that's an interesting story, but where did you get that?" And she'd say, "Well, my grandmother told me." And later in life, my brother had the DNA testing, and genetically we are partially Northern European. So that proves out the fact that the story that my mother was told and was telling us. It was just my grandfather for a bit. I want to say possibly a year, but then he brought his family, and he had at that time a young child by the name of Juan Ramirez who took the name John Ramirez. They were in LA for a period of time because my mother was born in the same plaza, and she was born a twin, but her twin did not survive. And then she had a little brother, Frank, who was also born in LA. He came to Santa Ana with 4 children. My Uncle Monty, who was a pharmacist, and who had pharmacies all over Orange County at one time. My Uncle John Ramirez, born in this country. I believe he was born in Mesa, Arizona. And my mother and her younger brother, Frank Ramirez, also born in LA. When I was 14, I think I had just turned 14, my parents decided that I needed to speak Spanish. We didn't speak Spanish at home because my mother had a terrifying experience with only speaking Spanish when she went to school. And she wanted her children to speak English first. So consequently, they didn't speak Spanish except when they were trying to hide something from us. And so we had that very common experience of being second generation and not speaking any Spanish, unfortunately. They shipped me off to a boarding school in Guadalajara, Colegio Victoria, which was at the time a premier school with the nuns. And I had no experience with nuns, no experience with Catholicism. My mother was a Methodist. My father was a fallen away Catholic. And so they wanted me not only to speak Spanish, but also to try and impress some ladylike qualities. I did learn to speak Spanish, and the result was when I came back from that wonderful experience in Mexico, which really taught me how great our people are and how classy and dignified and warm and loving they are. I came back and graduated from Marywood High School it used to be in Anaheim. After high school, I went to college. I went to junior college, and I worked in one of my uncle's drugstores. And I clerked for him, as I had done from the age of 14. I had to get a work permit. And so I have a Social Security record that goes back to the age of 14. And I worked there, and then I was hired by the Bank of Santa Ana, which was the prominent bank in town in those days, to be a trainer, to be trained as a teller, and also to move up to a public relations position. And I was hired by the president of the bank. And it was a wonderful, formative experience for me. Banking is a great basis for a lot of different business education and experience with people. And I really enjoyed that period of my life. I worked there till I was off and on until I was 21. My father had a fascinating life. He was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And he came to this country as a young executive officer in the Merchant Marine. He was charged with being just below the captain of the ship and taking supplies out to the soldiers in the Pacific during World War II. And they were constantly hunted down because if they could defeat the purpose of supplying the troops in the field, then those troops would be helpless. And his boats, in those days they were called the Liberty ships, and they were being produced quite rapidly to supply the troops. I've gone on board one, and it is absolutely, it's tiny. And you can't understand how those soldiers weren't just terrified. I'm sure they were. But his ships did take direct hits. He managed to survive. My brother tells me that he didn't talk much about it like most World War II vets, but he did tell my brother that one of the ships that he was on that took a direct hit arrived by the grace of God on an island just in time for it to sink. And so it was a miracle that he survived the war. And then he came to port at one point in time, I believe it was Long Beach, and was up in LA at the square. I'm trying to think of the name of that. In any event, he met my mother at the beautiful dinner house there. I think they exchanged glances across the floor, and it was love at first sight. And it was a love affair that lasted only 25 years. He died very young at 54, but there was never anybody else for my mother. She spoke of him all the time, and they had a wonderful relationship. My father's family is kind of an unknown to me. When he came here, he said that they were lost during the Perón regime. And so he lost contact with them. And they were people they were landowners, they were hotel owners. So they might have been victims of that whole reversal of fortune that was going on down there, where they were supposedly taking from the rich and giving to the poor. But what the Peronistas were really doing was taking from the wealthy and spreading it amongst themselves. So that's kind of a known quantity now. But my father did maintain contact with his cousins. He didn't have any siblings. And so on that side of the family, on the Ponte side of the family, I have very little knowledge. I've done most of my historical genealogical research on the Ramirez side. And my father's name was Jose Ponte, Ponte. His father's name was also Jose Ponte. He was born in 1914 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. His mother was Portuguese. Her last name was Caneiro, Caneiro, which is a typically Portuguese name. My mother was raised by an amazing man who knew that education was the key to everything. When he came here, he had an education as a master tailor, and he was also a musician. In fact, he was the leader of the Santa Ana Municipal Band, which played in the park, in Birch Park in those days on Sundays, and people would stroll as they did in Mexico and enjoy the music, and it was a free concert. And there are pictures out there. I've seen them. I don't have any of them. But
them too.
of him as the leader of the municipal band. But he was married to my grandmother, Celia Figueroa Ramirez, and she died young. And he continued to persist in his ideals that his children be educated. As a matter of fact, one of my uncles is a USC School of Pharmacy grad, and another is a Stanford University of Chicago grad in chemical engineering. And of course, my mother went to Berkeley. And a neat story about that is that he would send her a blank check and say, Cecilia, fill this out for whatever you need. And then a week or two later, he would call her and say, Cecilia, you haven't cashed your check yet. What's going on up there in Berkeley? And she told me that she would tell him, Dad, I'm so embarrassed that you're sending me all this money. I just don't know how much to fill it out for. He said, fill it out for whatever you need and do it now. So he was very supportive, which is very remarkable because in those days, Hispanic men didn't generally believe. In fact, the majority of them believed that their daughters didn't even need high school. I have spoken to women just a bit older than I, 10, 20 years older than I, who have told me that their fathers told them, no, get a job. You're just going to get married anyway. What do you need a college education? What do you need a high school education for? So there were those who didn't believe, and there are today as well. I mean, it's kind of incredible, but there are those. So my grandfather was a remarkable man. He was warm and loving, and I can still remember when I had my tonsils out when I was a little girl, him sneaking me ice cream and my mother saying, what are you doing? And him saying nothing, and me enjoying the ice cream, and it felt really good on my throat. So, but he would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and head out to the pan dulce store and be back in time for breakfast with pan dulce, and he was just a kind, wonderful, big bear of a guy, big man. My mother majored in Spanish and history at Berkeley, but she was also very enthralled with physical anthropology, definitely world affairs. I had people come up to me at her memorial service and tell me that how much they enjoyed talking to her because she was so well informed and she kept on top of everything. She was just curious about the world and history, and she used to be able to quote the stock market, and my brother used to tease her and say, my brother is so funny, Paul, my youngest brother, he used to say, Mom, what do you care about the stock market? And she'd say, Paul, never mind, don't go there. But they had a running banter that was, he was always trying to point out that there were some things that were trivia that she didn't need to memorize. My mother's name was Cecilia Ponte de Ramirez. My mother went to elementary schools in Santa Ana. I want to say that she went to Roosevelt, and from there she went to the middle school at that time. It wasn't Lathrop. It was in the north part of Santa Ana. In any event, my mother won the DAR award for Student of the Year from her class, her 8th grade or 9th grade graduating class. And from there she went on to Santa Ana High. And she had some teachers that she was really fond of that became lifelong friends. One of them was Helen Glancy. I still remember her talking about her. And she was the only teacher who had an automobile, so that was pretty unique. And she ended up marrying a gentleman, and they bought the Julian Inn together and refurbished it. And of course now it's kind of historical for the fact that boxers train there occasionally. But it has an interesting history. But she was a lifelong friend of Miss Glancy's. And her friends were, she had a diverse group of friendships, and they were lifelong, which is what Santa Ana is kind of all about. It's now a big city, but with a small town feel, and everybody knew everyone, and it was interesting. I hope that some of the qualities that that were so outstanding with my mother, I hope I have gotten just even a fraction of her kindness, her openness to new ideas. She was open until her last breath. I had to pull my mother away from believe it or not, the New York Tennis Open to get her to the emergency room. I said, "Mom, please, we have to go. I just want to watch this last set." She was amazing, and she loves music. She loved art. Back in the day, I remember some of the prints that we had on the wall were Chagall and Renoir and Degas, and some of the painters who painted the South Pacific were her favorites. And my father had brought her some gifts from the Philippines when he was there during the war. Before he knew her, he brought her some beautiful, colorful things from the Philippines. He may have taken one more trip out to the Pacific after they met and brought her back some lovely things. And they were items of curiosity for us as little kids in Santa Ana. We'd never seen such beautiful colors and hand-carved shoes and beautiful silk gowns. So my mother was gracious. She was so overwhelmingly grateful for anything you did for her. She always thanked me, which made me feel terrible because I didn't feel that she needed to thank me for anything I did for her. And some of my earliest memories of working in my uncle's drugstore were that I had enough money to buy her really lovely things for Christmas. And I can remember one Christmas I bought her, there was a beautiful jewelry store downtown around the corner from the drugstore, and I bought her a gold charm bracelet with a charm that actually played music. And she was just overwhelmed by that. And then I also bought her beautiful, beautiful underwear and things that she didn't buy for herself, because it was always about the kids. And in those days, times were not easy. And so that gave me so much pleasure to be able to do that for her. She was so intelligent and, as I said, a wonderful conversationalist. From my father, I got probably, I hope I got a tiny bit of his scientific mind. He and I used to fight over the latest issue of Time magazine, and he'd say to me, "Pammy, where did you put the Time magazine?" Because he read it cover to cover as I did when I was a kid. And he had a great sense of humor. He was very dignified, and I remember when he came down to Guadalajara to pick me up from the convent, he was probably the only gentleman who could go shall we say, toe-to-toe with the head mother. And she was concerned that he had a gold lapel pin in the shape of almost like a star. And she was concerned that I found out later, that it might have something to do with the Communist Party. You know how completely provincial those little nuns must be when they think that way. And so, but he answered all her questions to her satisfaction, and they became great friends. She was one tough old nun, and we all lived in fear of her opinion. And then there was a mother much older than she, probably in her 80s, and I can still remember her on the arm of a young nun while I was there, walking down the corridor, and I was behind them, and I had on leather flats, and somehow they were hitting the floor inappropriately. In other words, they were making too much noise, or I wasn't stepping correctly. And I remember this elderly nun turning around and saying to me, "Please pick up your feet, dear." And I remember it as, even though it was done softly, it was still a reprimand. And you did things by the book in the convent. And I loved the structure of it. And I ended up loving the Catholic faith. When I went down to school in Guadalajara, I was determined to be the rebel and never buy into all the formalities and the daily Mass and the weekly Vespers and the morning call with the nun walking through the dormitory saying, "Time for the Rosary, girls," at 6 a.m. It was very structured, but the bonus was that I was away from my raucous little brothers who were constantly creating chaos and trying to set the house on fire. And I had peace and quiet and calm and structure. And I really ended up enjoying it as one of the best parts of my life. My father initially started out as a surgical technician for Beckman Instruments, but he also worked for Rosan Incorporated, and they were located at the beach in Newport Beach, right on the water. And I'm trying to remember what they built, but it was something that was very high tech, and he was the inspector. The year abroad, as you say, was a real turning point for me, because I think I became more of a young lady. I had been running with a crowd in Tustin of girls that were, at that time in the 60s, they called it, wild and crazy if you got in a car and ran around at night for an hour or so. But we had... There were some things that we were doing that my parents didn't approve of. My father didn't approve of me wearing lipstick. I did not drive until I went to college. So he was a typical Spanish father, very rigid, and had his ideas about what a young lady should be and how she should behave. So I think I came back more tuned into what he saw as appropriate activity, and my mother did too. And I resumed my role as my uncle's clerk and came from Marywood in the afternoon to his drugstore on the corner of 6th and Main, Monty's Pharmacy, and clerked. First I did my homework, and then I clerked, and then my mom picked me up at 8, and I went home to do more homework. But it was a very... It was a really great experience working for my uncle, because I also learned the ability to relate to his clientele and the work ethic. I started out at Orange Coast College, and then I thought I wanted to be in medicine, so I was kind of trying to do a pre-medicine. But then I got so involved, it's a shame, I got so involved with work that it kind of went by the wayside. And I was very active socially because coming from a girls' school, it was all a new world for me to be involved with all these fun projects like Secretary of the Student Body and then, of course, there was the Miss Santa Ana pageant, and everything changed after that. That's pretty much around the time that I moved on to Bank of Santa Ana and kind of stalled my college education and went into the banking training, and and got a certificate in that. I do have also certificate from Purdue in very high-end life insurance planning. So I went back for that. I was sponsored by the insurance company I was writing business for, and that was my second career. My cousin, who also was a pharmacist, encouraged me to sign up for the trials, and I don't know what they were called then, competition. But there was also a sign at the In-N-Out. Back in the day, we had our own In-N-Out in Santa Ana. Had nothing to do with the current day In-N-Out. It was just a wonderful drive-through that this darling couple had over on the corner of Cubbon and Main, right nearby where I grew up. And there was a big sign that said, Chamber of Commerce wants you to apply for Miss Santa Ana pageant. And so I kind of thought about dipping my toe in the water, and I signed up. And the evening of the pageant, the judges were Del Fetterman, since deceased, lovely man, the older brother of a friend of mine. When I was at Marywood, Dick Fetterman, his younger brother, was at Servite, and he became a great friend. Litriana Fernandez, who was Miss Santa Ana from some previous year, beautiful gal, the daughter of the owner of Tiernan's Typewriter, which was a big company in Santa Ana in those days. And she was a beautiful Hispanic gal. I believe her father was a Spaniard. And I can't remember the other members of the panel, but it would have been the heads of the Chamber of Commerce. So I was judged by them, and then surprisingly enough, out of left field, won. And I remember Lee Fernandez saying to me, "You have a presence, but you've got to do something about your legs." And I said, okay, I guess I need to walk more. But she did it kindly. She did not do it in any kind of a snippy, or she was just being helpful. She said, if you want to go on, you're going to have to work out. So I took it as it was presented to me. And it started a year of a lot of great experiences with people from the business world in Santa Ana. I promoted the city of Santa Ana. I went to ribbon cuttings for opening businesses. One of the most interesting ones was the opening of Edinger all the way through to Tustin, from probably Huntington Beach or wherever it ends. But it was a big deal for the County Board of Supervisors. And at the time, one of the supervisors was there, Cy Featherly. He was an older gentleman at the time, for whom Cy Featherly Park is named, over by Green River off of the 91 freeway. And just a charming man. I went to so many wonderful things, and the world opened up for me. And from there I went on to the Miss Orange County pageant, which was used to be part of the Orange County Fair at the fairgrounds, and met some great gals. And from there to the Miss California pageant, which was in Santa Monica, and it was the first time that it had been televised. And so my dad got to see it on TV, and he was just, it was so adorable. You know how fathers are, that they think that their daughters are the best. And so he said, yes, I watched it, but I still don't understand why you didn't win. And I said, Daddy, were you watching the same thing as I was? Because I had no chance against those beautiful girls. As a matter of fact, my roommate won. And I just remember Miss Beverly Hills and Miss Hollywood being just stunning girls. And it was a very broadening experience for me. I wore a sash that said Miss Santa Ana, and I appeared, for example, on the float. They built a float for me. It was sponsored by one of the title companies, and I can't remember the exact name. It's in the pictures that I've sent on, I believe. And then my princesses were surrounding me, and so I had the pleasure of waving to my little brothers off of this huge platform and throwing them candy, I think. But they were impressed, or so they said. But and then a lot of friends who appeared along the route. In Santa Ana, we used to have a wonderful Christmas parade, and they decorated all the poles, all the light poles, and everyone came out for it. It was down Main Street. And I appeared in formal wear at openings, such as the opening of Edinger, opening of banks, opening of department stores, etc., and did my thing, and it was nothing that was ever compensated for. You had to take time away from your job or your school or whatever it was. But I completed 1 year, and then the following year, the young lady who was chosen didn't appear to want to do the work. So the Chamber of Commerce asked me if I would be their Miss Ambassador. And I was Miss Ambassador for another year and made appearances for them, and et cetera, and got to know some wonderful people at the Chamber of Commerce. There was a gentleman who was coming out of, he was just retiring at the El Toro at the Light of the Air Base, which is where the helicopter squadrons are. And he, his name was Colonel Bill Duncan, and he and his wife grew very attached to me. He was the head, he became the head of the Chamber of Commerce, and they had me at their parties and were trying to be matchmakers. But and they had a little daughter named Jan. She was just a darling girl, but they were lovely people, and I met a lot of really great people, and more to that that Light of the Air Base. This probably would be more appropriate when I talk about our construction business. But when we built 200 military units, housing units for the non-coms at El Toro, it happened to be an opening, ribbon cutting, and the introduction of the first residents for that state-of-the-art building. We won the gas company award for efficiency on that project, which was a very high honor. But on the day of the opening, my husband had to be at another project that we had in Louisiana at Fort Polk. We were building 650 homes there, plus 2 generals' estates. And so he asked me if I would represent the company, and of course I did. I went out there and I invited my brother's in-laws, and then that was Colonel Mike Costello and his beautiful wife Marty, my sister-in-law's parents. I invited them because they had been attached to Light of the Air. He had been one of the helicopter instructors. In fact, had instructed hundreds and hundreds of young pilots for Vietnam. And I invited them, and I thought it would be just such a fun experience for them. And we got there, and we were all standing around, me with our engineers and other dignitaries, and here comes the commanding general and his staff. And nowhere is the young non-com who is about to be introduced to his new residence with his family. And I turned to Colonel Costello and I said, I was so nervous. What in the world is going to happen? And he said, well, I don't know, but the general waits on no one. And so here comes this flustered, skinny non-com running down the street, hauling his wife with their children. And I was so relieved, but I said to Colonel Costello, what do you think they'll do to him? He said, well, he'll be on his knees in front of his commanding officer on Monday morning, begging for his life. So that's one of my stories about people that I met either through the happenstance of having been involved with the chamber, or through the happenstance of having been present at an opening where things didn't go, shall we say, exactly as planned. The competition was an evening program where you wore a gown and then you wore a bathing suit, and there was no talent, or it was a very small pageant. It was a very small local pageant, and I don't remember how many girls participated. I'm kind of thinking 10 to 15. And then I had my princesses, who were the runners-up. The float for the Miss Santa Ana pageant, for the Miss Santa Ana participation in the Christmas parade, was a large white ruffled float with touches of poinsettias and things on it. I did have some wonderful friends who'd been either Santa Ana or Newport Beach or Huntington Beach queens. As a matter of fact, Lee Fernandez became a good friend of mine, and she was really a guiding star. Everything she did was perfect and well done and very ladylike. And her real name was Lee Triana, which I think is an unusual, beautiful name. And she had a cousin by the name of Sarah Jane Bartholomew, and Sarah Jane was the daughter of a gentleman who was a very well-known investor and gold mine owner. And Sarah Jane, after she was Miss Newport Beach, went on to Miss Orange County. But I don't remember how much further she went. She ended up marrying a pitcher for the Dodgers, I think, and had 4 girls of her own. She had a program on TV recently where she took her daughters to some of her dad's gold mines in Alaska and revisited them and tried to see what was left of her father's legacy. So she had an interesting life. And I didn't see much of them after we all married and had families, but they were great friends at the time. My career as a banker and as public relations for the Saddleback Inns kind of slowly drew to a close after I married Rudy and we had our first child. I didn't work for a while, maybe 6 months. And then he asked me if I would join him in his business, and I became front desk, reception, interaction with the attorneys and the CPA and the accountants, and et cetera, and then eventually moved to just supervising the performance of the what we called in those days RFPs. The RFPs were responses to in certain cases, a federal request for bids on federal projects, which included the military bases, et cetera, et cetera. But when we were doing business with the federal government, the military, those bids were not only produced by us, but all the plans and designs, et cetera, architectural, structural, landscaping. You can imagine what that took for a project that entailed a request for a bid on a 200 home, 500 home, 650 home project. It was streets, gutters, landscaping, play yards, community centers. It was a small city. And so we would have meetings in the office almost daily amongst those technical people who were either engineers, landscape architects, structural, everybody who participated in the bid. And then we would ask for bids from our subs. If it was local, and we had a huge part of the office was dedicated to them coming in and looking at the plans, which were highly secretive, because we were in competition with other companies that would have loved to have seen our plans. We became very proficient in producing plans that not only complied with the RFPs, but also were economically sound, financially competitive, was huge. If you can think of points being applied for certain things like a really nice play yard, a really nice kitchen, a well-constructed home, well-designed streets, and on and on. I'm just hitting some hot topics here, but it was very, very complex, and there were very few companies who could compete with us. We became very good at it. When we landed on the Fort Polk job, the one that was the 650 homes, my husband didn't really want to go there. He really thought that Louisiana was a poor source for trained and experienced subs, and a long ways away and difficult to control, and the weather conditions were, even in those days, before Katrina, the weather conditions were unbelievable. We actually watched whole streets wash away in the rains and have to be redone. There was a conflict, and if I said that it was over the fact that we didn't do concrete drives, we did asphalt drives, that would be a part of it. That was a part of the conflict that we came into with the military over what we produced. We also came into a conflict over, we had produced a, let's just say we had produced a sample home that was accepted. Once it was accepted, we could go on and build however many of those. And they at one point, for whatever reason, decided they were going to reject it after they had accepted it. We'd already built those homes. And so we had a huge conflict on that project. And the only reason he had gone there was because our joint venture partner, who was Titan of New Jersey, had asked us, they were to be the bond people who produced the bond. It was a huge bond for a $40 million project. In those days, $40 million today would be probably almost $200 million. I can tell you that what I decided to do was I had always wanted to go back into banking, and I love financial products, and I got an insurance license, and I told my husband, you did it for 20 years, now I'm going to do it. I'm going to haul this ship forward, and I'm going to make sure that our boys have whatever they need. And so I got an insurance license, and I became an insurance broker, and I loved it. I really loved it. And I ended up being, and I hate to pat myself on the back, but this is truth. I ended up being in the top 1% of all insurance agents in the world, the $1 Million Round Table. My favorite thing was the people that I met in that world that were, especially those who were so tuned in to serving their clients, because that's the whole crux of that business, is bringing them to the right place and sharing your knowledge with them and solving their problems. I think of myself as a problem solver in a lot of ways, and there's always a way. There's always a way you can find to help somebody, bring them to a better place, and secure their future. My mentors were great women who were at the forefront of such programs as Girls Incorporated. I can remember Ann Cella and she was the wife of Dr. Cella, who was a prominent Santa Ana physician. She started Girls Inc. here in Santa Ana, and I was probably 30 when she asked me to join her. It was mostly concentrated in the southern part of town, and we met down there with the girls and gave them guidance and mentorship. And then I had another great mentor who I became friends with through Children's Home Society. Once again, we raised money for families that needed respite care, needed help with foster care, whatever it was, adoption services. But I met her at the initial welcoming luncheon for the new aspirants to become members of Children's Home Society, and we sat next to each other, and it was absolutely a gift to me because we had so much in common. We both had boys. We both thought of ourselves as great cooks, but she was educated. She had an education as a top chef, and she and I just had the same mindset of helping children. We were friends for over 40 years through the Children's Home Society and then way beyond that. But she died just 2 weeks before my husband, Rudy, and I miss her every day because, as I said at her funeral when I gave the eulogy, I always taught my boys, always look for friends who are a bit better than you are because they will bring you up. And that's exactly what Barbara was to me. She was an example of what a woman should be, a mother should be, hardworking, had a tremendous work ethic. I volunteered with her a couple of holidays at her catering events. And I would lose 10 pounds when I volunteered with her because it's a very physical business. And I was always astounded at how she was 10 years older than I and how she kept up with it. It was amazing. So she was another wonderful mentor. Other mentors were women I knew through Children's Home Society in addition to her, who were leaders in Assistance League. They were leaders in the Orange County Performing Arts. We raised money. We had innovative ways of doing it. I'm going to show you some pictures later of one event that just absolutely rocked the world. And when we moved to the Santa Ynez Valley in 1982, the first phone call I got was from the local chapter of Children's Home Society. It was probably the oldest chapter in the state. And they said, we heard all about you and the kind of money that you raised down in Santa Ana, and we'd like for you to join us for a meeting. And I thought, oh my gosh, just when you think you're getting out, they pull you back in. So I went to a meeting, and this was so completely different from Santa Ana because these were women who probably still had their boots on. They'd just come out of the field or off of the track where they were training a horse, and they were just the most warm, lovely, down-to-earth women. And I thought, what can we do up here in horse country that would be comparable to our formal luncheons at the Disneyland Hotel, 300 women, with a full mariachi and on and on and on. And I thought, I will grab the female chiropractor and she can talk about nutrition, and then the little darling shops in Solvang can bring their clothes in and we'll have a mini fashion show and talk about nutrition and fitness. And then there's that daughter of that great gossip columnist who dated Prince Philip, and her daughter just danced with Prince Andrew at the ball that they put on for him in Los Angeles. We'll have her come and talk about what it's like to dance with a real prince. And I thought, oh wow, this might really work. So this is in 1982. We charged $50 for a luncheon, the fashion show, and this little talk. And And I got her mother to agree that she would go on as our little mini speaker. She's a lovely young woman. And the day came, and the attendance was absolutely wonderful. We had this event in one of the mansions in the San Ynez Valley. Everything was lovely, and it's time for this young woman to talk about dancing with Prince Andrew. And she comes up to me and she says in her little airhead way, "I don't know what to say." I said, "Well, talk about dancing with Prince Andrew. What did he say? Didn't he say anything to you that?" She said, "Well, I said, "Okay, well, just do whatever it is." And she was fine, but it didn't turn out in the way it was in my head, which was we were going to have this wonderful, revealing talk about what it's like to dance with a prince. I should have had Cinderella. Yeah. And that kind of goes back to something else that I did I thought was a wonderful touch, was when we had one of the opening galas for fundraising for Orange County Performing Arts at the Balboa Bay Club. And my dear friend Barbara, we were the terrible two. We always had these crazy ideas of how we were going to pull this off and how we were going to raise all kinds of money, and what one didn't think of, the other one did. So we thought we'll have the Gypsy Ball a la Gitana at the Balboa Bay Club, and then we'll have, oh, I know what, Rudy's dear friend Guillermo, who owns La Fiesta on Main in Santa Ana, our favorite place to go for Mexican food, has a daughter-in-law who's a beautiful girl whose sister stars in the Copacabana program, the Folies Bergère in Las Vegas, and they sing and they dance and they're beautiful, wonderful. We'll have her perform. And so Rudy went to Guillermo and he said, yes, she'll be there, blah, blah, blah. And so we get to the Balboa Bay Club and we have a wonderful dinner or cocktail hour, and this young lady is supposed to come on, and she's all dressed. You'll see pictures of this. It's very misleading. She's dressed in this darling Mexican outfit. She looks just spectacular. And she comes up to me, here we go again. What am I supposed to do? I said, well, you're supposed to dance. And she said, why? I don't know how to do that. I said, oh my God, Barbara and I are going to have to dance. And I said to Rudy later, I said, what in the heck? He said, you didn't ask me if she was talented like her sister. I said, well, why do you think I wanted her there, for window dressing? And it was like, oh no, another fine mess, Ollie. But anyway, we kind of carried it off. I don't remember who danced. It may have been Rudy. But we carried it off, and we made a lot of money for Orange County Performing Arts that night. So anyway, lots of stories in the city. Lots of stories, yeah. Well, we had 3 sons. His son from his first marriage, Tommy, who was his right-hand man. And then Rob was born in 1971. And Greg was born in 1976. And they were both athletic and involved in all kinds of sports and hobbies. Rob, our older son, was very involved in radio-controlled airplanes, very scientific. And every summer I would put him through an RC class because it really absorbed his attention. He loved it, looked forward to it. There was a shop in Tustin that the son of the owners, the Kellys, ran, where they taught radio control. They taught model building, radio control, etc. And so we spent a lot of time at the radio control outlet in Fountain Valley. It was a very expensive hobby. And I still remember the boys taking his little brother and his nephew over to Miles Square Park to fly he had just put together this, oh my gosh, it must have been at least a 2-foot, 3-foot, it wasn't the largest he ever built, but it was a very large radio-controlled airplane. Took months to build. And the plane went up, and then the plane augered in, and it just went straight into the ground in a million pieces. And my younger son, Greg, and his cousin, David, couldn't stop laughing. They were just bowled over with laughter. It was probably nervous laughter, but Rob never forgave him for that. He took weeks to speak to them after that. And Greg's big passion, Rob also was very involved in physical training and football at Servite, and he was on the championship baseball team at Servite. And they went through these programs from early childhood on up. They played ball from the time they were young boys. And I was always team mother. And then when they got into high school, I was Hell Week mother, which Hell Week mother is when you cook for them when they're practicing during the last week of summer, and it's really intense and it's really hot here in Southern California, and they need nutrition and they need hydration. And so I would make dinners such as, I would do a tri-tip barbecue, I would make lasagna, I would do carb loads, and I learned all about that. And I would do what they called their secret bread that made them win. And it was Italian rolls that I fried in butter and oregano and salt and pepper, and they were divine. But they loved those. They couldn't win without the Italian rolls. And those were some of the best days of my life, really. Feeding the team was just, and Rudy would be there at practice with the barbecue and doing hot dogs. And so our lives really circulated around their interests and taking them places where they needed to go for a paper, such as down to San Diego Old Town to see the herb gardens. And I remember a paper he wrote for Servite was that was the subject of it. And we had a great family life. This is the family motto because when things got kind of sketchy with the boys, if they were ever being obstinate or whatever it was, and they were a joy to raise. They never gave us any trouble. Rudy would always say, love will always prevail. And so that's why I brought this. I thought this was his philosophy of life. I'm going to talk about not the first supposed date that I knew nothing about, but I'm going to talk about when he invited me to go see boxing in LA at the LA Olympic, which was the big venue in those days, big deal. And he insisted that it would be a wonderful way to have dinner and go see a boxing match. And I said, you know what, I oppose violence in any form. I could not watch two people hitting each other. It's offensive to me. And then he went on to sell it as a ballet between two very well matched boxers who were athletes, and that if you watched it in that context, that it was like a ballet. And I still resisted. I resisted as long as I could. Finally, he talked me into it, and we went up to LA to see this match that was a big match. It was sold out, and the gal who was, believe it or not, she was a female boxing promoter. Her name was Eileen Eaton. And she had a son who was with her in her business, and Rudy had called him and said, I don't care how you get the tickets, I need 2 ringside tickets. And he said, Rudy, there are no tickets. He said, there are no tickets left. The only seats left are sitting next to my mother, and you don't want to sit next to my mother. Trust me. And Rudy said, why not? He said, because she has the mouth of a truck driver, and she gets going during those matches. And Rudy said, well, if that's all there is, we'll take them. So we went, and it was true. She was wild and crazy. And during the match, somehow, the boxer hit his opponent so hard, and he was coming out of the ring towards me, and at that moment, the sports writer, photographer for the LA Herald, I think it was in those days, took that picture of him coming towards me, and Rudy with his hands up, trying to protect me from this boxer coming out of the ring on top of me. So this picture hits the front page of the sports section the next day. And Rudy said that his phone was ringing off the hook from all of his friends that said, "What in the world were you doing up in LA with that girl?" And they were just laughing. It was hilarious. Of all things to appear on the front page of the sports section. So that was my initiation into Rudy's world. That was pretty funny. Well, it's humbling to even be asked that question, and I appreciate that. But it's really also very selfish of me, because it's what I have a passion for. From the time I was 14 years old and was a candy striper at St. Joseph's Hospital, and met my first little co-worker, who was Carolyn Dunton. She was the daughter of Dunton Ford. Back in the day, Dunton Ford was a big auto dealer here in Santa Ana. And my mother had gone to school with him, and now here was his beautiful little daughter helping me with our little trek through the halls of the old St. Joseph's, which really dates me. The old St. Joseph's, with the nuns in their black garb running down the hallways, and us taking sweets and magazines, etc., to the bedsides of the patients. Back in the day, you could do that. You could offer sweets and whatever else they needed or wanted, and then we would have beach parties, and her dad would set them up for Dad and Mom would set them up for us with the little candy stripers at the beach. So there was an element of camaraderie and entertainment there too. But from then, when I was in high school at Marywood, we had our projects that we did for community service, and on into being with the Bank of Santa Ana. We also had our charitable our charitable functions through that. But the next time I really got involved in groups was when I was invited to be a member of Children's Home Society, which, as I said before, was a function of raising money for families that wanted to adopt and maybe didn't have the resources, or were fostering children and needed help, or for respite care needed help with some downtime. They were taking care of a child that was impaired or had some kind of psychological damage and required a tremendous amount of effort and energy, and they needed time away from that. So we raised money for that and had a lot of fun doing so, and I've brought some actual programs from one of the most successful fundraisers we did, which was A Day with Trevia. And Trevia was the great designer who did that. If you will recall, Marilyn Monroe standing over the grate and the dress blowing up. And you could tell by his design, he was Cuban, that he loved women. He loved their forms, and he featured them. He didn't knock them down or make them walk the plank in some kind of a robot outfit. He made the female figure so beautiful. And so he agreed. We paid him a lot of money, and he agreed to come to Santa Ana and be the star and commentator in our fashion show. And by him doing so, we were able to attract 400 women to our luncheon, which was a record. And Rudy suggested to me that wouldn't it be fun if we involved his favorite thing in the whole world, since it was going to be a Latin commentator and a Latin show and Latin design, wouldn't it be perfect to have a mariachi? And I thought, I don't know, maybe that's taking it a step too far. Don't forget, these are all the women of Santa Ana are new to this mariachi thing that you love so much. But that became the hit of the whole show. We had a full mariachi band by the poolside, and they played during the social hour. Rudy had spoken to his friend, who was a young man, the son of an educator at UCLA, who had taken his family on a year abroad or 2 years abroad to Spain, and they had learned to speak perfect Spanish and enjoyed the whole Spanish culture so much and the music that they formed a band called the Mariachi Uclatlan. And what that is not an Indian name. It's UCLA with a TAN on the end of it. So he approached him and he said, my wife is putting on this fashion show. It's for the kids. And won't you come and do the hour, social hour? And they not only showed up gratis to us, they didn't charge us a dime. They were in their full regalia, the beautiful suits of light with gorgeous hats and playing their wonderful music. And it became the hit and the talk of Children's Home Society of Santa Ana was the success of that event. And it was Rudy's brilliance that carried that day. But also the show was wonderful. And I think in those days, back in the early 80s, I think we were charging $25 or $35 a ticket. So that was what today those would be probably $100. But we put on a lovely luncheon and then had him commentate his current line of clothing, and then offer the attendees a discount on his beautiful designer clothing. It was a great success. So when they heard that I was in town in Santa Ynez, of course they called me up and said, what can you do for us? Oh, the Elks. That's my new passion. New 20-some years. But I have been working with the Elks. Primarily the women's group at the Elks is the Emblem Club. And we have a group of 100 and some women who also do fundraisers, but we do them for community service purposes, such as the vets and the new vet residents out at the district area. We also raise money for Sir Bruno Serrato over at the Anaheim White House, who feeds over 5,000 children a day. And for such projects as the Young Mothers Support Groups, we have baby showers for them, and we bring in lovely things for their babies. We have a vet shower coming up in November. That's what we historically have done in November. We have fresh underwear for them, and they're thrilled to get it. And hundreds of pieces. Last year, I think we have over 400 pieces of bagged up fresh underwear. We also do assist a group called Working Wardrobes in getting women mostly, but also men, back to work, bring in very lightly used either clothing, accessories, belts, jackets, jewelry, any other type of thing a woman would need to have four different outfits for a new job. They train these people to get back into the workforce, and that's one of our favorite charities. We actually are also raising money every year to provide, I think we're up to 1,500 or 2,000 backpacks for children starting school in September. And that's a fresh backpack with the supplies in it for kids whose families can't afford to supply that for them. So that's been very successful. And that is now called the Linda Fernandez Backpack Project, because she really took it to a whole nother level in the last few years she's been in charge of it. So we get great support from the Elks on that. And we give scholarships. Last year we gave 5 scholarships, and this year we'll do that or better to young people from the Santa Ana School District. Mostly, some are Tustin, but we just have a variety of fun events. We enjoy them very much. At the same time, we're doing good in the community. My dad was a pet lover, and any cat that was roaming around went immediately to my dad. So he was an attraction point for. And learned it from both my parents, but mainly my dad. And I've always had a pet or two and enjoyed them very much. Yeah, they're very comforting. I have OC, a Kitten Academy. It really belongs to my, I call her my daughter. She's actually my daughter-in-law. But I help her out when I can with her effort to save every damaged or thrown away kitten. They come to her with litters sometimes, and she has what we call the 7 downstairs, or failed adoptees, because she just couldn't stand to part with them for one reason or another. For perhaps they are just not attractive because they only have one eye, or they're very needy, or whatever problem it is she hopes to resolve eventually with them. And then she's got her little kittens, and she even has an incubator for the sickest of the kittens to help them breathe and get oxygen and be under a humidifier for the really tough first few weeks of their lives. So really enjoy that. They are adorable, and they learn to love, and they learn to be socialized, and people come and see them and adopt them and are so happy to get them, because they are just, love never fails. Love will always prevail, and it's so evident in those little kittens that are very adoptable. My lasting legacy, I hope, will be being of service and seeing the humanity in every individual, and always having compassion and empathy for others. You can never give enough service to your city, to your interest groups, because it brings so much back to you. It's almost selfish, because it brings so much back to you in your knowledge of people and your associations. My best friends are through my community service groups, and we just have so much in common in wanting to feed the hungry and clothe the poor, and make sure that every child has an equal opportunity. I know that sounds Pollyannish, but we do our best to see that happens through not only the Elks, but and Emblem Club, but also through the other groups I've been involved with. And even Orange County Performing Arts started out with a mission of educating children about music. And it still does. They still have their wonderful programs, not through COVID, of course, but I'm sure we'll start that again, the music programs for all the children in Santa Ana.